Hello, and welcome to the LVP Architects podcast. Hi, and welcome to this episode. We're going to talk a bit on construction and building control as a study subject. In respect of construction, we've mentioned in previous podcasts that during the construction phase, the main contractor is responsible for the site. So what that means is they are in control of the safety of who and when people go on site. From the client to design team to some contractors, the main contractor is responsible for it all. So even the client can't just wander on site. They need to speak to the main contractor. When can they go? And the main contractor will guide them, just as yourself will guide you through the site, unless you have a CS card, in which case, if you have one of the appropriate card, there are different scales, and subcontractors, workers have their own versions as well. So that's important to know, because undoubtedly there will be a question on there is an issue on site, and your answer will not begin with you rush to site. The main contractor is the one, and there is a clear process that will be set out in the contract of any issues to site. So there are mechanisms, if they discover something that could potentially cause a delay or additional cost, there are notification procedures of those that the main contractor will have to follow. So if you're the contract administrator, you will deal with those, and there's certain time frames for that and all the rest of it. In terms of construction itself, if you're, again, the CA, there are interim certificates that you will need to issue at key stages, and interim certificates are a method for payment from the client to the main contractor for works that have been done. It's quite important to pay main contractors so that they can pay their subcontractors. There is a key thing about not withholding money, and you might want to do a bit of research on that. This is why I say understand the procurement route. If you're just appointed as the architect only at client side and it's a D&B, you may not be the CA, that might be the project manager. So none of this is really relevant for you in that answer. Understanding it is. So in your answer you could say, well, my assumption is, if it's not clear in the paragraph, there is a project manager and they would have to do X, Y, and Z. You're trying to demonstrate in the exam and the case study that you understand. So it's key things that, there are other certificates that need to be issued in the CA, and we've mentioned it before in previous podcasts. What I'd recommend is you can download sample contracts, and there are some really good books out there on them and sort of summaries. I would recommend you kind of just list the certificates that are needed for each building contract type, for each procurement, so you've got it clear in your head. So that way, if you make an assumption, because it's not clear enough in your question, and say, this is a D&B, though my role is not this, we will be waiting for this certificate or that certificate or whatever. Or if it's after handover and it's a defects period, but actually it's a D&B and you're appointed to the contractor, the client will contact via potentially a project manager the main contractor to say these defects need to be made good and so on. In terms of issues on site, so you'll probably get a question on that. It depends on what issue. Is it a services issue? Is there a burst main? Again, rewind a little bit on this podcast, and what is the main thing? The contractor is in charge of the site, not you. The only effect it may have is maybe there's going to be a meeting just to discuss, is there alternative service routes we can do, and then there's a coordination and some thinking on from the civils and the electrical and, whatever relative authorities need to be notified. There's that kind of process that you may be involved in. But you won't be the one who flags up to the client, if that's not your role, that there is an issue. In terms of other issues, construction issues, that is, Obviously, I've previously mentioned building contract has mechanisms for delays. So, the delays are either material, construction, design, weather delays, and so on. And they have certain mechanisms in there of notifying in advance that this may happen. So depending on the procurement type and the building contract. Other things, if there is a construction issue, I don't know, say they discover something that they weren't expecting to be there while they're building the extension, there's a process again. Now, is it a design issue? Who's your client? How will you be notified? How will you respond? And what are the processes of that response? How does that translate into getting that issue resolved? So there are, in a lot of cases, you have time to resolve things, so you can sit down and plan and draw up. Other times it needs to be quite a quick turnaround. But again, there is a similar process on how that's done. Obviously, describing site issues in a podcast seems, that it's all chill and it's all cool, it's all easy. Obviously, when it happens, it can be quite stressful, but it's about being kind of cool and calm and listening to not just the design team but the contractor about what the best solutions there are to achieve the same end product. Usually you can resolve them quite quickly. The only consequences may be cost and time, and it's finding the balance between those that the client can be happy with and the contractor. So I'm hoping that this is all kind of sinking in now, and that it's not all big and scary, that you don't need to know the building contract off by heart, but you do need to understand what certifications and processes there are involved during the construction if you are the contract administrator. Understanding that none of that really applies to you if you're not appointed as a CA, but you need to understand it so that when it does happen, you know how many days there are to respond on behalf of either the client or the contractor, in terms of providing some drawings or evidence or whatever it be. Very briefly, building control. You should be aware if you've worked on a project that there is building control. They're usually mentioned pretty quickly. Very few projects do not involve building control. There are three main application types of building control. There's full plans, building notice, and regularization. You need to understand how things are monitored. Visits and what certificates are issued by either the building control officer, which is usually the local authority linked, or an approved inspector, which is more of a private sector individual. They're there at key points to make sure that what is being constructed is following building regulations. So they'll appear early on when you're laying pipes in the ground to make sure that they're the right depth, that they are covered appropriately as set out in the building regs, and then foundations, similarly, they'll visit then, and then at other key points. This is all organised and coordinated by the main contractor. You as an architect won't generally get involved. Even if it's a small house extension, you won't really get involved with inviting or dealing with building control as such, because that contractor will notify when works are happening, their program, and provide them with the relevant information. If it's a full plans submission, then you would have done all the drawings and relevant specs and details that need to be submitted to building control to get it signed off or commented on. But generally, the key thing is information, site visits, and certificates. If you don't get the certificates, they potentially could ask you to open up an awful lot of things to prove that it's built as is. At very worst, they could ask you to take it all down. I hope that's been helpful. We've covered briefly construction and building control. I think in the next podcast we'll talk about handover and defects period. So tune in next podcast. See you then.